The afternoon sun blazed down on Westminster Bridge as thousands of tourists moved in slow waves across the famous London landmark. Among them walked James Mitchell, a decorated veteran of the British Army who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. His chest displayed a collection of military medals that told the story of his service: the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, the Operational Service Medal, and most prominently, the Military Cross he had earned for extraordinary bravery under fire. James was not on duty today. He had taken leave from his current position as a ceremonial guard at Buckingham Palace to visit his elderly mother in South London. The 34-year-old soldier had decided to walk across the bridge rather than take the underground, wanting to enjoy the crisp autumn air and clear his mind after a particularly difficult week of standing guard in the pouring rain. As he walked, James noticed the usual mix of tourists snapping photos of Big Ben and the Thames. Street performers occupied their usual spots and vendors sold souvenirs from small carts. The atmosphere was peaceful and familiar, exactly what he needed after the rigid formality of palace duty. Near the center of the bridge, James paused to check his phone for a message from his mother when he noticed a group of young men approaching. There were 4 of them, probably in their early 20s, dressed in expensive streetwear and gold chains. Their leader appeared to be a tall, thin man with multiple tattoos covering his neck and hands. They moved with the swagger of people who believed they owned whatever space they occupied. The group's leader, who went by the street name Tank, had spent the morning drinking in a nearby pub with his crew. Tank had a reputation in his neighborhood for being unpredictable and aggressive, especially when he had been drinking. He had been in and out of prison for various offenses, including assault, theft, and drug dealing. Today, he was feeling particularly bold after successfully intimidating a shop owner into giving him free cigarettes. As Tank's eyes fell on James, he immediately noticed the medals glinting in the sunlight. To Tank, these weren't symbols of honor and sacrifice. They looked expensive, like jewelry that could be sold for quick money. His alcohol-clouded judgment told him this was an easy target. Just one man, probably soft from military life, carrying what looked like valuable items. "Look at this fool," Tank said loudly to his friends, gesturing toward James. "Walking around like he's some kind of hero with all that fancy jewelry." His voice carried across the bridge, causing several nearby tourists to turn and look. The confrontation was beginning to draw attention, but not the kind that would help James. James looked up from his phone, immediately assessing the situation with the trained eye of a soldier. He recognized the signs of trouble: the aggressive posture, the way they had positioned themselves to block his path, and the predatory look in their eyes. His military training kicked in, and he began calculating possible escape routes and defensive positions. "These aren't jewelry," James said calmly, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "They're military medals awarded for service to Queen and country." He hoped that explaining the significance might diffuse the situation. James had learned during his service that sometimes education could prevent violence. Tank laughed mockingly, a harsh sound that made several tourists step further away from the growing confrontation. "Military medals? You mean like toy soldier awards?" He stepped closer to James, invading his personal space in a clear act of intimidation. "They look real shiny and expensive to me. Bet they'd fetch a good price at the right shop." The other members of Tank's crew spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle around James. This was a practiced move, something they had done many times before when cornering victims. The tourists on the bridge began to notice the tension and started moving away, creating a growing circle of empty space around the confrontation. James felt his jaw tighten as Tank continued to mock his service medals. Each piece of metal on his chest represented months or years of hardship, danger, and sacrifice. The military cross alone represented the day he had risked his life to save 3 wounded comrades under heavy enemy fire in Helmand Province. These weren't just decorations. They were symbols of brotherhood, duty, and honor. "You don't understand what these represent," James said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "These medals were earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. They're not for sale. And they're certainly not for the likes of you." His military bearing became more pronounced as he straightened, his shoulders and fixed Tank with a steady stare. Tank's face darkened at what he perceived as disrespect. In his world, backing down from any challenge meant losing face in front of his crew. The alcohol in his system made him even more aggressive than usual, and the presence of witnesses made retreat impossible without looking weak. Blood, sweat, and sacrifice, Tank mocked, mimicking James's serious tone. Sounds like a bunch of military nonsense to me. All I see is shiny metal that could buy me a nice dinner. He reached toward James's chest, his fingers aiming for the military cross. Let me have a closer look at these precious medals of yours. James stepped back quickly, his hand instinctively moving to protect his medals. The movement was fluid and controlled, showing years of combat training. Keep your hands to yourself, he warned, his voice now carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed under pressure. The confrontation had reached a critical point. Tank's crew was watching their leader to see how he would handle this resistance. The tourists on the bridge had formed a wider circle, some filming with their phones while others called for police. The afternoon that had started so peacefully for James was about to take a dramatic and dangerous turn. Tank's eyes narrowed as he processed James's defiance. In his experience, most people backed down when faced with his aggressive approach. This soldier was different, and that both intrigued and angered him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything James had learned about courage, honor, and standing up for what was right. The tension on Westminster Bridge thickened like fog rolling in from the Thames. Tank's face twisted into an ugly sneer as he processed James's refusal to be intimidated. The young thug had built his reputation on fear and violence, and he wasn't about to let some toy soldier make him look weak in front of his crew and the growing crowd of onlookers. "Oh, we've got ourselves a tough guy here," Tank announced loudly, playing to his audience. His three companions, Marcus, Danny, and Lee, moved closer, forming a tighter circle around James. They had done this dance many times before. Surround the target, create pressure, and wait for them to break. It had worked on shopkeepers, other gang members, and random victims they had chosen for robbery. James remained calm, his years of military training serving him well. He had faced Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, survived IED explosions, and led men through some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. 4 street thugs on a London bridge, while concerning, were not beyond his capability to handle. He continued to assess the situation, noting the positions of each attacker and the possible escape routes. Tank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small knife, the blade glinting menacingly in the afternoon sunlight. Several tourists screamed and moved further back, while others began frantically calling the police on their mobile phones. The presence of the weapon changed the dynamic entirely, transforming what might have been a simple confrontation into a potentially deadly situation. "Now let's try this again," Tank said, his voice taking on a more threatening tone. He held the knife low, partially concealed but clearly visible to James. "Those medals look real nice, and I think they'd look better on me. Why don't you just hand them over and nobody has to get hurt today?" James's eyes focused on the knife while maintaining awareness of the other 3 men. His military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure and to never give in to terrorist demands. And in his mind, this was exactly what Tank was, a domestic terrorist using fear and violence to get what he wanted. "I've told you already," James said firmly, his voice carrying across the bridge. "These medals represent something you clearly don't understand. They're not going anywhere with you." He shifted his weight slightly, preparing for the violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, forming a wide circle around the confrontation. Some were filming with their phones, while others shouted encouragement to James or pleaded for someone to call the police. The situation had attracted the attention of street performers and vendors, who watched with fascination and concern. Marcus, one of Tank's crew members, spoke up nervously. "Tank, man, there are too many people watching. Maybe we should just leave it." He had noticed several people on phones and could see police sirens in the distance, though they seemed to be responding to something else entirely. Tank whirled around to face Marcus, his eyes blazing with anger. "Are you questioning me?" he demanded. "This soldier boy thinks he's better than us with his fancy medals and military attitude. Nobody disrespects Tank and walks away." The alcohol and adrenaline in his system had made him completely irrational. Unable to see the growing danger of the situation, James watched this exchange with interest. Recognizing the dynamics within the group, Tank was clearly the leader through intimidation rather than respect. and his crew was beginning to have doubts about this confrontation. This was valuable information that might be useful if the situation escalated further. "Look around you," James said, addressing all four men but keeping his primary focus on Tank and the knife. "You're surrounded by witnesses and the police will be here soon. You still have a chance to walk away from this without serious consequences." His tone was reasonable but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to dealing with volatile situations. Tank's response was to take another step forward, bringing the knife closer to James. "The only one who needs to worry about consequences is you, soldier boy. I've been to prison before and I'll go again if necessary. But first I'm going to teach you some respect." The crowd gasped as Tank made a sudden lunge forward with the knife, aiming for James's chest where his medals were displayed. But James was ready. His military reflexes, honed by years of combat training and real-world experience, kicked in automatically. James sidestepped the knife thrust with fluid precision, grabbing Tank's wrist with his left hand while simultaneously driving his right elbow into Tank's solar plexus. The move was executed with the speed and efficiency of someone who had been trained to disarm armed opponents. Tank doubled over, gasping for breath as the knife clattered to the ground. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as James kicked the knife away, sending it skittering across the bridge's walkway. Tank's three companions stood frozen, unsure whether to help their leader or flee the scene. They had expected an easy robbery, not a trained fighter who could neutralize their leader in seconds. Tank struggled to breathe, one hand clutched to his chest where James's elbow had struck. His face was red with pain and embarrassment and his eyes blazed with fury. The humiliation of being defeated so quickly in front of witnesses was more painful than the physical blow. "You're going to pay for that," Tank wheezed, still trying to catch his breath. "Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" Despite being disarmed and clearly outmatched, his pride wouldn't let him back down. The street reputation he had built over years was crumbling in front of everyone. James stood ready for the next attack, his stance balanced and professional. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he replied calmly. "A coward who threatens unarmed people and thinks that makes him tough. But you picked the wrong target today." The tourists continued to film and photograph the confrontation, with several people live-streaming the events on social media. The story was already beginning to spread online, with hashtags about the brave soldier defending his medals against thugs. Danny and Lee, two of Tank's crew members, began backing away slowly. They could see that this situation had gone far beyond what they had signed up for, and they had no desire to face the same treatment their leader had received. Marcus remained closer but looked ready to run at the first sign of police sirens. Tank slowly straightened up, his breathing becoming more regular, but his face still flushed with anger and humiliation. The knife was now several feet away, but he seemed to be calculating whether he could reach it before James could stop him. The confrontation was far from over, and Tank's wounded pride was making him even more dangerous. Tank's humiliation burned like acid in his chest as he watched the crowd's reaction to his defeat. Phones were pointed at him from every direction, recording his embarrassment for the world to see. The reputation he had spent years building in the streets was being destroyed by a single soldier in front of hundreds of witnesses. His crew was backing away and he could see the doubt in their eyes. "This isn't over," Tank snarled, wiping blood from his lip where he had bitten it during the impact. His pride demanded retaliation, even though his rational mind knew he was outmatched. "You got lucky with a cheap shot, but let's see how tough you really are." James maintained his defensive position, reading Tank's body language like a book. Years of combat experience had taught him to recognize when an opponent was about to do something desperate. Tank's posture, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the discarded knife, and his obvious rage all pointed to an escalation rather than surrender. "Walk away," James said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed in life or death situations. "You're already in enough trouble. Don't make it worse for yourself." But even as he spoke, James knew that Tank's wounded pride wouldn't allow him to retreat peacefully. The crowd had grown even larger, with people streaming across the bridge from both directions to witness the confrontation. Among them was Sarah Chen, a tourist from Singapore who had been visiting London with her family. She had her phone out filming everything, when she noticed something that made her heart race with fear. While everyone's attention was focused on Tank and James, Marcus had quietly moved toward the dropped knife. The thin, nervous member of Tank's crew was trying to retrieve the weapon without being noticed. Sarah opened her mouth to shout a warning, but Marcus was already reaching for the blade. Tank saw Marcus moving toward the knife and felt a surge of renewed confidence. "Yeah, that's right, Marcus," he called out loudly, abandoning any pretense of subtlety. "Get me my knife back. This soldier boy needs to learn some manners." James spun around to see Marcus grabbing the knife and instantly recognized the increased danger. Now he was facing 4 opponents again, and one of them was armed. The situation had just become much more serious, especially with innocent civilians all around who could be hurt if the violence escalated. "Police! Police!" Several tourists began shouting, but the nearest officers were still several minutes away, dealing with a separate incident near Parliament Square. James was on his own, surrounded by armed criminals and responsible for protecting not just himself, but the dozens of innocent people watching the confrontation. Marcus held the knife awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the weapon, but desperate to help his leader save face. "Here, Tank," he said, tossing the knife toward his friend. "Show this army boy what happens when you mess with us." Tank caught the knife with a triumphant grin, his confidence returning now that he was armed again. "Now we're back to how this should be," he declared, pointing the blade toward James's medals. "Those pretty decorations are coming with me one way or another." James quickly calculated his options. He could try to disarm Tank again, but with 3 other opponents and innocent bystanders everywhere, the risk of someone getting seriously hurt was too high. He needed to find a way to end this confrontation without escalating the violence further. "You really want to do this in front of all these cameras?" James asked, gesturing toward the crowd of filming tourists. "Every major news network in London will have this footage within the hour. Is that really the kind of attention you want?" Tank paused for a moment, some of his confidence wavering as he looked around at the sea of phones pointed in his direction. But his pride and the alcohol in his system overrode his common sense. "I don't care about cameras," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "All they'll see is Tank taking what he wants from some fake soldier. The insult to his service and his brothers-in-arms who had died fighting for their country sent a flash of anger through James. But his training kept him controlled and focused. He had learned long ago that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford in dangerous situations. "Fake soldier?" James repeated, his voice deadly calm. "These medals were earned in Afghanistan, fighting Taliban terrorists who used knives just like yours to threaten innocent people." His eyes never left Tank's face, reading every micro-expression for signs of the next attack. Tank's face twisted with rage at being compared to terrorists. In his mind, he was just a businessman conducting a transaction, albeit with unconventional negotiation tactics. "I'm nothing like those foreign terrorists," he spat. "I'm just collecting what's owed to me." "What's owed to you?" James asked, genuinely puzzled by Tank's logic. "How do you figure that my medals are owed to you?" Tank waved the knife in the air as he spoke, becoming more animated and dangerous.
"Society owes me," he declared loudly.
"I never got the chances that people like you got. Nobody gave me medals for being tough, so I take what I need from people who have more than they deserve." The crowd listened in fascination to Tank's twisted justification for his actions. Several people were shaking their heads in disgust, while others seemed almost hypnotized by the surreal nature of the confrontation. James realized that Tank wasn't just a simple criminal. He was someone who had convinced himself that his crimes were justified. This made him even more dangerous because he genuinely believed he was in the right. Such people were often willing to go to extreme lengths to prove their point. "Nobody gave me these medals," James said patiently, trying one more time to reach Tank's rational mind. "I earned every one of them through service, sacrifice, and putting my life on the line for others. That's how it works in the real world. You earn what you get." Tank's response was to take a step forward with the knife raised, his face contorted with rage. "Don't lecture me about the real world," he snarled. "I've been living in it longer than you have. And in my world, the strong take from the weak." "Then you're about to learn something new about strength," James replied quietly, settling into a combat stance as Tank prepared to attack again. The confrontation was about to reach its climax, and James knew that this time Tank wouldn't be content with just trying to grab his medals. Tank lunged forward with the knife, driven by rage and desperation to salvage his reputation in front of the watching crowd. But this time, James was ready for a more aggressive response. As Tank closed the distance, James didn't just defend. He went on the attack. Moving with the fluid precision of a trained warrior, James caught Tank's knife hand at the wrist and twisted it sharply upward while simultaneously driving his knee into Tank's ribs. The combination of pain and leverage forced Tank to drop the knife again, but James wasn't finished. Using Tank's own momentum against him, James spun the thug around and applied a rear chokehold that he had learned during his military combat training. "It's over," James said firmly into Tank's ear, as he maintained the control hold. "You can surrender now, or I can put you to sleep and wait for the police. Your choice." Tank struggled against the hold, but James's technique was perfect. The chokehold was cutting off blood flow to Tank's brain without crushing his windpipe, a technique designed to subdue without causing permanent damage. Within seconds, Tank's struggles began to weaken as consciousness started to slip away. "Let him go. Let him go," Danny shouted, the youngest member of Tank's crew. In his panic, he picked up a piece of construction debris from a nearby repair project and raised it threateningly. "I'll smash your head in if you don't let Tank go right now." James assessed this new threat while maintaining his hold on Tank. Danny was clearly terrified and acting on impulse rather than training. This made him extremely dangerous, as frightened people often did unpredictable things. The crowd of tourists began screaming and backing away further as they realized the violence was escalating. "Think about what you're doing," James called out to Danny, keeping his voice calm despite the dangerous situation. "Your friend attacked me with a knife. I'm defending myself. If you assault me with that debris, you'll be facing serious criminal charges." But Danny was beyond rational thought. Seeing his leader being choked unconscious had triggered a panic response, and he was acting purely on the gang loyalty that had been drilled into him since childhood. He charged forward with the concrete chunk raised above his head. James was forced to release Tank to defend against Danny's attack. Tank collapsed to the ground, gasping for air and only semi-conscious. James sidestepped Danny's clumsy assault and grabbed the young man's wrist, using a simple Aikido technique to redirect Danny's energy and send him tumbling harmlessly to the ground. The crowd erupted in cheers as James demonstrated his superior training once again. But the celebration was premature. Marcus and Lee, seeing their two friends defeated, decided to attack simultaneously from different angles. They had no martial arts training, but they hoped that numbers would overcome skill. James found himself in the most dangerous position yet, facing two attackers while Tank was recovering and Danny was getting back to his feet. The situation had become a full-scale brawl on one of London's most famous landmarks. With hundreds of tourists witnessing every moment, Marcus came in low, trying to tackle James around the waist while Lee aimed high with wild swings at James's head. James dropped his center of gravity and used Marcus's momentum to throw him over his shoulder in a classic judo move, sending the thug crashing into Lee and knocking both men down in a tangle of limbs. The crowd was in absolute chaos now, with some people fleeing the bridge entirely, while others pressed closer to film the incredible display of combat skills. The sound of police sirens was finally getting closer, but they were still several blocks away in London's heavy traffic. Tank had recovered enough to stand, though he was still shaky from the chokehold. His face was purple with rage and embarrassment as he watched James systematically defeat his entire crew. Everything he had built his reputation on was crumbling before his eyes, and the humiliation was unbearable. "Enough," Tank roared, picking up the knife for the third time. "I don't care what happens anymore. I'm going to cut those medals off your chest and take them as trophies." His voice had taken on a wild, almost unhinged quality that made even his own crew members look at him with concern. James realized that Tank had passed the point of rational behavior. The thug was no longer thinking about robbery or even self-preservation. He was operating on pure rage and wounded pride. This made him far more dangerous than before, as he was now capable of anything. "Listen to me very carefully," James said, his voice taking on the commanding tone he had used with soldiers under fire. "You attack me with that knife again and I will stop holding back. I've been going easy on you because I don't want to seriously hurt anyone, but if you force my hand, I will end this permanently." The crowd fell silent at the deadly serious tone in James's voice. Even through their fear and excitement, they could sense that something fundamental had changed in the confrontation. This was no longer a street fight. It was about to become something much more serious. Tank raised the knife again, his hand shaking with adrenaline and rage. "You think you're so tough with your fancy military training," he snarled. "Let's see how tough you are when you're bleeding on this bridge." Sarah Chen, the tourist who had been filming everything, suddenly shouted from the crowd, "The police are here. I can see them coming up the stairs." She was pointing toward the south end of the bridge, where uniformed officers were indeed approaching, pushing through the crowd of onlookers. Tank heard her shout, and his eyes widened with panic. He was already facing assault charges, but if he was caught with the knife, the charges would be much more serious. In his desperation, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of surrendering or fleeing, Tank decided to make one final attack on James, hoping to grab the medals and escape in the confusion. He raised the knife high above his head and charged forward with a wild scream, intent on ending the confrontation once and for all. James saw the attack coming and knew that his time for mercy had ended. Tank was clearly beyond reasoning, and with police approaching, innocent people could be hurt in the chaos. It was time to use his full military training to end this threat permanently. As Tank charged forward with the knife raised above his head, time seemed to slow down for James. Years of combat experience had taught him to enter a state of hyper-focus during life-threatening situations, where every detail became crystal clear and his body moved with automatic precision. James stepped into Tank's attack rather than away from it, a counterintuitive move that surprised the charging thug. As Tank brought the knife down, James caught his wrist with both hands and used Tank's own momentum to drive the criminal's arm downward, while simultaneously bringing his knee up. The result was devastating. Tank's forearm struck James's knee with tremendous force, and the sickening crack of breaking bone echoed across the bridge. Tank's scream of pain was heard by everyone on Westminster Bridge as he dropped the knife and collapsed to his knees, clutching his clearly broken arm. The bone was bent at an unnatural angle and his hand hung limply from his wrist. The fight had gone out of him completely, replaced by waves of agony that left him gasping and whimpering on the ground. "Stay down," James commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Move again and I'll break the other one." Tank was clearly in no condition to continue fighting, but James wasn't taking any chances. He kicked the knife far away from all the combatants and maintained his ready position. The three remaining crew members, Marcus, Danny, and Lee, stared in shock at their broken leader. They had never seen Tank defeated so completely, and the sight of his twisted arm filled them with terror. Any thoughts of continuing the fight evaporated instantly, as they realized they were dealing with someone far beyond their capabilities. The crowd of tourists was in an uproar, with some people cheering James's victory, while others were horrified by the brutal efficiency with which he had ended the confrontation. Phones continued to record every moment, and the footage was already being uploaded to social media platforms around the world. Police Constable David Williams was the first officer to reach the scene, pushing through the crowd with his partner, PC Sarah Martinez, close behind. Both officers had heard the reports of a knife fight on Westminster Bridge and were prepared for a serious situation, but they were still surprised by what they found. Armed police. "Everyone step back," PC Williams shouted, though he could see that the immediate danger had passed. Tank was clearly incapacitated. His crew had surrendered by raising their hands, and James stood calmly in the center of it all, still protecting his medals. "Officer, I'm James Mitchell, serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces," James said clearly, maintaining his position, but showing no threat to the police. "These 4 men attacked me with a knife in an attempt to rob my military medals. I defended myself using reasonable force." PC Martinez quickly assessed the scene, noting Tank's broken arm, the knife on the ground several feet away, and the testimony of numerous witnesses who were eagerly shouting out what they had seen. The situation was unusual but fairly clear-cut, a soldier defending himself against armed robbers. "Ambulance is on the way," PC Williams reported after calling for medical assistance. "Sir, can you tell me exactly what happened here?" He began taking James's statement while his partner secured the scene and separated the suspects. Tank was still writhing in pain on the ground, alternating between groans of agony and curses directed at James. "He broke my arm," he cried out when he saw the police. "I want to press charges for assault." "This is police brutality!" PC Martinez looked at Tank with barely concealed disgust. "According to about 50 witnesses, you attacked this gentleman with a knife after threatening to rob him," she said firmly. "You're the one facing charges here, not him." Several tourists eagerly approached the officers, wanting to give statements and show their video footage of the confrontation. Sarah Chen, who had filmed the entire incident, played back the clearest footage for the police officers. "This is incredible," P.C. Williams said, as he watched Tank's attacks and James's defensive responses. "This gentleman showed remarkable restraint throughout the entire confrontation. Any reasonable person would have used much more force much earlier." The ambulance arrived with sirens wailing, and paramedics quickly attended to Tank's broken arm. They confirmed that the bone was fractured in multiple places and would require surgery to repair properly. As they prepared to transport him to the hospital, one of the paramedics commented quietly to his partner that he had seen similar injuries in his military service. They were consistent with advanced combat training techniques. Marcus, Danny, and Lee were handcuffed and placed in the back of police vehicles. All three were clearly shaken by what they had witnessed and were cooperating fully with the officers. They provided statements confirming that Tank had initiated the confrontation and attacked James with a knife. "I never seen nothing like that before," Danny said to P.C. Martinez as she took his statement. "Tank always said he was the toughest guy around, but that soldier made him look like a child. We should never have messed with someone like that." James remained calm throughout the police investigation, answering questions thoroughly and professionally. His military bearing and clear factual recounting of events impressed both officers, who had dealt with many violent confrontations but rarely seen such restraint shown by a victim. Dr. Emily Thompson, a military psychologist who happened to be among the tourists on the bridge, approached the police officers after giving her own witness statement. "Officer, I work with combat veterans and I can tell you that this gentleman showed extraordinary control," she said. "His training could have allowed him to end this confrontation much more violently, but he chose to use only the minimum force necessary to protect himself and the civilians around him." The crowd gradually began to disperse as the excitement died down, but many people remained to watch the aftermath and ensure that James was treated fairly by the police. Several veterans in the crowd had identified themselves to the officers and vouched for James's character and service record. P.C. Williams completed his preliminary report and approached James with a respectful expression. "Mr. Mitchell, based on the evidence and witness statements, it's clear that you acted in self-defense against an armed attacker," he said formally. "You're free to go, though we may need additional statements from you later." James nodded his thanks but remained concerned about one thing. "What about his crew?" he asked, gesturing toward the police vehicles where Marcus, Danny, and Lee were waiting. "They were part of this attack even if they didn't use the knife directly." P.C. Williams assured James that all four attackers would face serious charges. "Tank will be charged with armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and threatening behavior," he explained. "His crew will face charges of conspiracy to commit robbery and assault. They were all part of this attack, regardless of who held the knife." As the police completed their investigation and began to pack up their equipment, word of the confrontation had already spread far beyond Westminster Bridge. The video footage shot by tourists had gone viral on social media, with millions of views and thousands of shares within just a few hours of the incident. News crews from BBC, Sky News, and other major outlets were already setting up outside the hospital where Tank was being treated, hoping to get interviews with anyone involved in the dramatic confrontation. The story was being picked up by international media as well, with headlines praising the hero soldier who defended his medals against thugs. James's mother, Margaret Mitchell, was at home in South London watching the afternoon news when her son's face appeared on screen. The news anchor was describing how a decorated veteran had fought off 4 armed attackers on Westminster Bridge while protecting his military medals. Margaret immediately recognized her son and began crying with a mixture of pride and terror at how close he had come to serious harm. At Buckingham Palace, news of the incident had reached James's commanding officer, Colonel Robert Hayes. The colonel was reviewing the initial police reports and witness statements, preparing to recommend James for commendation rather than discipline. The restraint and professionalism shown during the confrontation reflected extremely well on the military and the Palace Guard unit. Meanwhile, at London Hospital, Tank was coming out of surgery to repair his shattered forearm. The surgeon, Dr. Patricia Stevens, had inserted metal plates and screws to reconstruct the bone, but she warned that Tank might never regain full use of his arm. The injury was severe enough that it would likely affect his ability to commit violent crimes in the future. Tank's lawyer, Michael Crawford, arrived at the hospital to find his client heavily sedated, but facing a mountain of legal troubles. Crawford had represented Tank in previous cases and knew that this time would be different. With clear video evidence of Tank attacking an unarmed man with a knife, and dozens of witnesses to testify, there would be no possibility of claiming self-defense or mistaken identity. The prosecution has an airtight case, Crawford explained to Tank's girlfriend Maria, who had rushed to the hospital. Tank attacked a decorated war veteran in front of hundreds of witnesses while trying to steal military medals. The judge is going to throw the book at him. Back on Westminster Bridge, James finally felt safe enough to call his mother and let her know he was unharmed. Margaret had been trying to reach him ever since seeing the news coverage, and she burst into tears of relief when she heard his voice. "I saw it on the television," she sobbed. "They said you fought off 4 men with a knife. James, you could have been killed." Her voice carried all the fear and love of a mother who had already worried through 3 deployments to Afghanistan. "I'm fine, Mum," James assured her gently. "My training kept me safe, just like it always has. These weren't trained fighters, just street thugs who picked the wrong target." He tried to downplay the danger to spare his mother additional worry, but she had seen enough of the footage to understand how serious the situation had been. Dr. Emily Thompson, the military psychologist who had witnessed the confrontation, approached James as he finished his phone call. "Excuse me, Mr. Mitchell," she said politely. "I wanted to thank you for what you did today. You showed exactly the kind of restraint and professionalism that makes the military proud." James was grateful for her support, but remained modest about his actions. "I just did what any soldier would do when attacked," he replied. "These medals represent the sacrifice of better men than me, and I wasn't about to let some street criminals steal them for drug money." Dr. Thompson shook her head in disagreement. "What you did today went far beyond basic self-defense," she insisted. "You could have seriously injured or killed those men with your training, but you chose to use only the minimum force necessary. That takes real character and discipline." As the afternoon progressed, James learned that his actions had resonated with people far beyond the tourists who witnessed them. Veterans groups were praising his defense of military honors, while law enforcement officials were using the incident as an example of proper self-defense techniques. The video footage was being analyzed by combat instructors at military academies, who were impressed by the textbook application of defensive techniques under pressure. James had demonstrated exactly the kind of controlled response that military training was designed to produce. Tank's crew members, now in holding cells at Westminster Magistrates' Court, were beginning to understand the full consequences of their actions. Marcus, the one who had retrieved the knife for Tank, was facing the most serious charges after Tank himself. Danny and Lee were cooperating with police in hopes of receiving lighter sentences. "I never thought it would go this far," Marcus confessed to his court-appointed lawyer. "Tank just said we were going to scare some guy into giving up his jewelry. Nobody told me they were military medals or that the guy was a trained fighter." The lawyer, Jennifer Walsh, had reviewed the case files and knew that her clients had very few options. "The video evidence shows all of you participating in the attack," she explained. "Your best hope is to plead guilty and hope for mercy from the judge based on your cooperation with police." As evening approached, James was finally able to leave Westminster Bridge and continue his journey to visit his mother. The medals on his chest had been slightly damaged in the scuffle, but they were still securely attached and exactly where they belonged. He had protected them not just as pieces of metal, but as symbols of everything he and his fellow soldiers had fought for. The story was far from over, however. The legal proceedings would take months to complete, and the media attention would continue to follow both James and his attackers. The confrontation on Westminster Bridge had become more than just a failed robbery attempt. It had become a symbol of standing up for honor and refusing to be intimidated by criminals. 3 months later, the case of Tank Williams and his crew came to trial at the Old Bailey, London's most famous criminal court. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, veterans advocates, and members of the public who had followed the story since the dramatic confrontation on Westminster Bridge. Tank sat in the dock with his arm still in a specialized brace, the metal plates and screws in his forearm, causing him constant pain and severely limiting his mobility. The injury had ended his career as a street criminal, as he could no longer intimidate people with physical threats. His lawyer had argued for a reduced sentence based on his disability, but the prosecution had little sympathy for injuries sustained during the commission of a violent crime. James entered the courtroom in his dress uniform, his medals polished and properly displayed on his chest. The same decorations that Tank had tried to steal now served as a powerful visual reminder of the honor and sacrifice that the defendant had attempted to violate. The contrast between the two men could not have been more stark, one representing service and duty, the other representing selfish criminality. Judge Catherine Morrison had reviewed all the evidence carefully before the trial began. The video footage from multiple angles showed clearly that Tank had initiated the confrontation, threatened James with a knife, and continued to attack even after being disarmed multiple times. There was no question about guilt, only about the appropriate punishment. Mr. Williams, Judge Morrison addressed Tank as she prepared to deliver the sentence. You and your associates attacked a decorated war veteran in an attempt to steal military medals that represent the highest ideals of service and sacrifice. Your actions were not only criminal, but deeply offensive to every person who has served their country with honor. Tank tried to maintain his defiant attitude, but the months in custody awaiting trial had broken much of his swagger. His arm injury had required multiple surgeries, and he was facing the reality that his life as he had known it was over. The street reputation he had built was gone, replaced by notoriety as the thug who had been humiliated by a single soldier. The prosecution had presented a devastating case, using the tourist videos to show every detail of the attack and James's restrained response. Expert witnesses, including military combat instructors, testified that James had shown remarkable control throughout the confrontation and had used only the minimum force necessary to protect himself and the civilians around him. Marcus, Danny, and Lee had already pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for their cooperation with the prosecution. They received sentences ranging from 18 months to 3 years, depending on their level of involvement in the attack. All three had expressed remorse for their actions and had been ordered to write formal apologies to James. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Morrison addressed James, who was serving as a witness for the prosecution. Your actions on Westminster Bridge demonstrated the very best of military training and personal character. You protected not only yourself but the innocent civilians around you, while showing remarkable restraint against armed attackers who clearly intended you serious harm. The judge's words brought tears to the eyes of James's mother, who was sitting in the gallery with other family members and fellow soldiers who had come to support him. The incident had brought unwanted attention to James, but it had also demonstrated the values that the military worked to instill in its members. Tank's sentence was severe but fair. 8 years in prison for armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and threatening behavior. The judge noted that the attack had been premeditated, involved a deadly weapon, and had targeted a symbol of national service and sacrifice. Tank's previous criminal record and lack of remorse had influenced the harsh sentence. You will serve at least 6 years before being eligible for parole, Judge Morrison informed Tank. And you will be required to complete anger management and substance abuse programs during your incarceration. Perhaps this time will give you the opportunity to reflect on the difference between taking what you want and earning what you deserve. As Tank was led away to begin his sentence, he looked back at James one final time. The hatred in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a grudging respect for the man who had defeated him so thoroughly. Tank finally understood that he had challenged someone who represented everything he had rejected in his own life: discipline, honor, and service to others. Outside the courthouse, James was surrounded by reporters hoping for interviews about the case and its outcome. He kept his statements brief and professional, emphasizing that he had simply done what any soldier would do when faced with armed criminals. These medals represent the sacrifice of men and women who gave everything for their country, James told the gathered media. I would have fought just as hard to protect any of my fellow service members' honors. That's what we do. We stand up for each other and for the values we've sworn to defend. The story of the confrontation on Westminster Bridge had become something larger than a simple criminal case. It had sparked discussions about military values, the importance of standing up to bullies, and the difference between earned honor and false bravado. Veterans organizations had used James's example to illustrate the ongoing character and dedication of military personnel. Dr. Emily Thompson, The military psychologist who had witnessed the original confrontation published a paper analyzing the incident as an example of proper crisis response training. Her research showed how military discipline and training could enable individuals to protect themselves and others while avoiding unnecessary violence. Tank's crew members, now serving their own sentences, had become examples of how following the wrong leader could destroy young lives. Prison counselors were using their cases to illustrate the consequences of gang loyalty and criminal behavior to other at-risk youth. James returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace, where he was quietly commended by his superiors for his handling of the situation. The incident had brought positive attention to the palace guard and demonstrated the high caliber of personnel serving in the royal household. A year after the confrontation, James received a letter from Danny, the youngest member of Tank's crew, who was approaching his release date. The letter was filled with apologies and gratitude for the restraint James had shown during the fight. "You could have hurt us much worse than you did," Danny wrote. "But you chose to protect yourself without trying to seriously injure us. That taught me more about real strength than anything Tank ever showed us. I'm using my time in prison to get my education and learn a trade so I never have to go back to that life." James kept the letter as a reminder that even the most difficult situations could sometimes lead to positive changes. His medals remained exactly where they belonged, on his chest, representing not just his own service but the values and sacrifices of every person who had worn their country's uniform with pride. The confrontation on Westminster Bridge had tested those values under pressure, and they had proven to be worth defending.